The knock hit the door hard enough to shake the glass. She froze with her hand on the kettle, steam licking her wrist. A second knock came, quick and sure. She moved without thinking, heart tight, feet cold on the boards, and slid the latch with her thumb. She opened the door a hand's width. The porch was empty. A rough canvas sack sat square against the threshold, tied with twine that bit into itself. No footsteps on the road, only the sack, mute and heavy, alone. "Who's there?" she called. Nothing answered. She heard only the kettle hiss. She crouched and touched the fabric. It scratched her fingertips. The knot was tight. She eased it loose. Warm air rose from the sack, the smell of wool and milk. A small face stared up at her with wide, steady eyes that did not blink. She sucked in a breath. "No," she said, small and useless. The baby moved, a slow ripple under the blanket. A folded slip of paper lay tucked at the edge. She pulled it free. The handwriting was neat, careful, the lines straight, the ink dark and clean. She read the 2 words and felt the floor tilt. "You promised." Her mouth went dry. "I never did," she whispered. The words came out fast, as if they had been waiting there. "I never did." The baby let out a thin sound. She slid her hands under the small body and lifted it free. Warm against her forearm, breath brushing her skin in tiny gusts. Lighter than feed, heavier than a letter. She looked to the yard again. The fence cut the field in a pale stripe. "If you can hear me, say something," she said. Silence pressed back. She stepped inside and closed the door with her hip. The house felt different, as if the room had grown smaller. She set the sack on the table and tucked the blanket close. The note lay open beside the kettle, the words black and steady. She read them again. "You promised," she said aloud, testing the shape. "Promised what? To who?" The baby blinked, untroubled. She touched the tiny fist. It closed around her finger. "What am I supposed to do with you?" she asked. "Who sent you here?" A faint creak came from the back step. She turned her head and held her breath. "Is someone out there?" Still nothing. She carried the baby to the bedroom and laid it on the center of the bed. The blanket was worn thin at the edges, patched with mismatched thread. Near the hem, a small stitched mark caught her eye, a circle with a line through it. What is that supposed to mean? Her gaze slid back to the note. She studied the letters. The hand was practiced, likely a man's, the pressure even, the strokes plain. The paper was thick, more like the old bills her father used to keep. Heat rose in her chest. She pressed it down. "No," she said, "not him." The baby kicked free 1 foot. She covered it again and kept her palm on the blanket until the small body settled. "It is all right," she said, though it was not. "You are safe for now." She rinsed a bottle from the drawer, hands moving by habit more than sense. "I do not know why I am doing this," she told the air. "I am not your mother." The words stung. "I am not anyone's mother." She warmed milk and tested a drop on her wrist. The baby latched, loud in the quiet. The sound pulled at a thin wire she had tried to forget. "Slow down," she murmured. "There is more." Her eyes kept slipping to the window. A shape lived at the edge of thought. A coat, a hat, a broad back. She blinked, and it was gone. "Coward," she whispered, not sure if she meant the one who left the sack or herself. She set the bottle aside and lifted the baby to her shoulder. A soft sigh warmed her neck. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "What does that note mean?" She folded the paper along the crease and slid it into her pocket. The edges dug into her skin. "You promised," she said again, quieter. "I never did." She checked the bolt twice, and then a third time. Floorboards answered under her feet as she moved through the rooms. Back at the bed, the baby's eyes were open, glassy and solemn. "All right," she said. "You can stay for now, only for now." A single sound rose from the yard, the light scrape of gravel. She went to the window and looked across the field. Nothing but fences, trees, roads. Her pulse kicked anyway. "Show yourself," she said. "If you're out there, show yourself." Silence held. The baby yawned. She tucked the blanket firm and stood very still. The note burned a square against her thigh. She kept her gaze on the dark beyond the porch and did not look away. She stood at the window, the baby's warmth pressing against her chest. Through the half-drawn curtain she saw him, just the back of him, his coat trailing behind, the mule's slow pace dragging in the distance. It was the trader. She'd seen him once before at the market, moving through the crowds, eyes flat, his gaze skimming over everyone like he was looking for something. But they'd never spoken. He didn't turn when she called, didn't even pause. She gripped the baby tighter, his small body curling against her, steady, like it belonged there. "Hey!" she shouted, louder this time, voice carrying across the open yard. Still, nothing. She stepped out onto the porch, feet bare against the cool wood. "I'm talking to you!" she yelled. Her voice hit the air and disappeared into it, a sharp echo she could almost hear coming back. The figure in the distance moved slower now, but not because he was stopping. He just didn't need to hurry. The wind tugged at the hem of her apron and she took a step forward, the boards creaking underfoot. But the man didn't look back. He didn't even slow. "Why the hell won't you stop?" She barely recognized the frustration rising in her voice, or how fast it turned into something cold. But she wasn't angry with him. Not really. She was angry with the note in her pocket. "You promised." She gripped it harder, the edges digging into her skin. She wasn't his fool. He'd never leave a baby on her doorstep unless it meant something. Something she couldn't ignore. She took another step, the baby squirming against her chest. "Wait!" She shouted again, but this time it came out weaker, like she didn't expect it to make any difference. He didn't turn. He just kept walking, his figure blending into the overgrown field, melting into the golden horizon. Damn it! She swore under her breath and turned back to the house. The door slammed behind her, the noise louder than the wind. She stood in the hall, staring at the rough sack still on the table, the baby quiet now, his eyes open wide and watching. She didn't know why she hadn't just left the child. She could have. She could have gone back to her life, the way it was before, simple, quiet. But something about it all, about the way he looked at her, made it impossible to let go. The baby whimpered softly. She rocked him in her arms, glancing once more toward the window. Still nothing. The field was empty now, not a trace of the trader. She heard footsteps on the gravel outside. A neighbor, her old friend Marla, always at the wrong time, always too curious. The sound of boots scraped closer, and the gate creaked open. "You're still out here?" Marla's voice was thin, casual. She was standing at the edge of the yard now, squinting toward the house. She turned and stepped out onto the porch again, keeping the baby close. "What do you want?" Marla raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking from the baby in her arms to the door she'd just closed behind her. "What is that?" she asked, her tone too sharp to be casual. "It's nothing," she said quickly, eyes flicking to the table where the sack still sat. Marla's gaze followed, narrowing. "I never said I wanted to know," Marla muttered, stepping closer, eyes flicking to the baby again, this time with more suspicion. "But I do know you, and this isn't like you." "I'm fine, Marla, just fine." Marla's lips pressed into a thin line as she examined the scene, the baby now quiet against her chest. "Right, and that?" She gestured to the table, to the note that wasn't quite hidden under the sack. The words "you promised" seemed to hang in the air between them. "You're not one to ask questions you don't want answers to." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She didn't like how they sounded. Marla wasn't stupid. She knew better than to push when there were lines to be crossed. Marla sighed, a soft, resigned sound that only made the space between them grow colder. "I'm just saying, you've always been quick to hide things, quiet-like. But this time," she looked at the baby, then back up to her face. "I don't think this is one of those times. Whatever's happened here, I don't think it's over." "You think I'm lying," she snapped, her words sharp and brittle. "No," Marla said simply, shaking her head. "I think you're in deep, but lying." She felt the weight of the note again in her pocket, the edges biting into her skin like it belonged to someone else. "I'm fine, Marla," she repeated, her voice low now. "Go back home." Marla stood there for a moment, studying her, the silence between them stretching. She knew better than to push now. She turned away, but not before adding quietly, "We all make promises one way or another." The gate clicked shut, and Marla was gone. She stood alone in the yard with the baby still in her arms. The field stretched out before her, empty, silent, like the promise that wasn't hers to keep. The knock on the door wasn't loud, but it was steady, firm. It made her stomach tighten as she crossed the room, the baby still cradled in her arms. She didn't need to guess who it was. It was the sheriff, standing outside with that look of practiced concern, like he'd already pieced everything together, even if he hadn't asked the right questions yet. She opened the door, just wide enough to see his wide-brimmed hat and the worn leather of his jacket. The badge gleamed in the light, but it was the way his eyes narrowed at her that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Afternoon, miss," he said, tipping his hat, his voice low, almost friendly, but she knew better. "Sheriff." She nodded, trying to keep her tone neutral, but something about his presence made the air feel heavier, like he was waiting for something to slip. "I heard there was a bit of a situation around here," he began, like he was making small talk, but his eyes flicked to the baby in her arms. He wasn't looking at her. "Not yet. Nothing to worry about." She kept her voice steady, even though the weight of the note in her pocket felt like it was pushing her down, like it could crawl up her throat at any second. The sheriff took a step closer, his boots scraping softly against the porch. He looked over her shoulder, then back at her. "I see you've got company," he said, his gaze settling on the baby again. "Found you a little bundle there, huh?" She clenched her jaw. "A stray, nothing more." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "A stray? A bit young for that, don't you think?" She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted the baby slightly, feeling the weight of those steady eyes on her. "Mind if I come in?" He didn't wait for an answer. The sheriff just stepped over the threshold, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The smell of the house, the dust, the faint scent of old wood seemed to press in around them. She didn't stop him. "I didn't invite you," she said, but it was a weak protest. She knew how this was going to play out. The sheriff glanced around, eyes scanning the room, as if he was already cataloging everything. "Quiet around here, too." "Quiet." He paused, his gaze lingering on the note left on the table, half hidden beneath the sack. She watched as his fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for it. "Where'd the baby come from?" he asked, finally meeting her eyes. "Not like something like that just shows up on your doorstep without some kind of, reason." "It doesn't matter," she said quickly, trying to sound more certain than she felt. "The child isn't mine." He didn't say anything for a moment, but she could see the way his lips pressed together in a tight line, like he didn't believe her at all. The air between them thickened. He walked closer to the table, leaning slightly, as if to get a better look at the note. "No name on the child, no explanation. Not very common, is it?" His tone wasn't harsh, but the weight of his words felt like a lead ball. "I said it's not mine," she repeated, more forcefully this time. "I don't know who left it, but I'm not the one who made this mess." He stopped in front of her, still standing too close, and she could feel the slow pressure of his stare. "You don't know anything, huh?" "I'm telling you the truth," she snapped, the words coming out sharper than she meant. The baby shifted in her arms, the small body seeming to sense the tension. She adjusted her grip, the movement enough to pull her back from the edge. "Why are you asking me these questions? I've done nothing wrong." The sheriff took a slow step back, his gaze flicking to the door behind her, to the sack on the table, back to the baby. "Just checking in. Gotta make sure there ain't something more to it. Folks around here talk, you know? There's been whispers about your family, about debts that weren't settled. You might not know much about it, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least ask." "Debts?" Her voice caught in her throat. She was sick of hearing about things that didn't exist, sick of rumors she'd never asked for. "There's nothing like that. My father's gone. He settled his business long ago. No one's got a claim on me." He didn't flinch at her outburst, just watched her with that look, the one that said he didn't believe a word. "Are you sure about that?" The note in her pocket burned again. She felt it pressing against her skin, like a question she couldn't answer. She swallowed hard. "I'm sure," she said, the words heavy and final. The sheriff leaned back against the doorframe. "You don't mind if I take a look around? Might clear up some confusion." His eyes flicked to the other rooms, the shadows around the house. She stood straighter, the baby still quiet in her arms. "You've done enough." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just doing my job. Folks depend on me to make sure things don't go sideways. You understand." "I understand." Her voice was low, "but I've told you everything I know." For a moment, the sheriff just stood there, his eyes lingering, scanning her face for something, anything. He seemed to come to a conclusion, and then he nodded slowly. "All right, but you know where I am if anything changes." He turned for the door, the weight of his boots echoing in the quiet house. Before he stepped out, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. "I'm not the one making you feel guilty, miss," he said, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask the right questions. You wouldn't want that, would you?" The door shut behind him with a finality that rang in her ears. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The house felt quieter somehow, more oppressive, as she stood there with the baby still in her arms, the note burning a hole in her pocket. She glanced at the table, but she didn't move toward it. She wasn't sure how much longer she could lie to herself or to anyone else. The market smelled of dust, salt, and old wood, the kind of place that seemed to hold its breath. She passed under the awning, the boards creaking underfoot, her boots scraping the worn planks. The stalls were busier than usual, voices rising over the chatter of vendors and customers haggling for the week's goods. But as soon as she walked into the open square, everything slowed. Her boots clicked on the ground, loud against the sudden quiet. The murmur of the crowd softened as if the air itself had paused, holding its breath. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, sharp, appraising, knowing. They watched, but didn't speak, their glances lingering just long enough to make her skin prickle. She walked through the narrow path between the stalls, the fabric of her coat brushing against the barrels and crates. The weight of the baby in her arms was a constant, though the child had fallen quiet, his tiny breaths even and soft. But it wasn't the baby that made the people stare. It was her, the stranger who now carried it, the woman they hadn't seen in years. She made her way to the far side of the market, where the trader's cart had been the week before. The mule wasn't there, and neither was the man. The cart sat empty, but she could still see the faded marks of the crate where the goods had been stacked. A rustle came from behind her, a soft shuffle of feet in the dirt. She turned, and there, standing just past the stall of dried herbs, was an older woman, her face weathered and worn with the kind of lines that only time and regret could carve. Her shawl was heavy around her shoulders, a dark color that matched her eyes, a sharp, piercing gaze that seemed to look right through her. "Looking for someone?" the woman asked, her voice low and gravelly, as if the words had been dragged from a place she hadn't visited in a long time. She stiffened, not sure how much she wanted to hear. "No," she said quickly, "just passing through." The woman didn't move, just stood there, eyes fixed on her, silent for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Funny how that happens, isn't it?" she said. "People passing through." She tried to step around the woman, but the old woman shifted, blocking her path. There was no anger in her stance, no force, just a quiet, unspoken demand for attention. "You're looking for him, aren't you?" the woman asked. Her lips curled slightly at the corners, though it wasn't quite a smile. "The trader, the one with the cart." She swallowed hard, not trusting her voice to sound steady. "I'm not looking for him." The woman nodded slowly, though there was no belief in her expression. "No? Well, then I suppose it's just a coincidence that you walked right to his spot, carrying a child no one's seen before." She stepped closer, leaning in just enough to make the air feel thicker between them. "It's strange, isn't it? How life works like that." She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "I don't know what you're talking about." The words were sharp now, clipped, but the woman wasn't fazed. "Oh, I think you do," the woman said softly, leaning even closer. "You're not the first to look for him, and you won't be the last either." A flicker of memory rose in her chest, but she shoved it down. She had to keep walking. She had to leave. She didn't want to hear this. The woman watched her, unmoving. "You know, he's not the kind of man you want to deal with," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "A man like that, he's not here for nothing." She took a step back, ready to move, but the woman's next words stopped her cold. "I saw him come through here last week. Not for the first time. You know who he is, don't you?" Her chest tightened, and she didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to the ground, unwilling to meet the woman's eyes, but she didn't move. The woman sighed, and for a moment, the world seemed to settle into a long, uncomfortable silence. The sound of distant voices from other stalls, the clinking of coins, the rustle of fabric in the wind, all of it faded, and it was just her and this woman standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. "Years ago, a man like him came through here," the woman continued, her voice dropping into a strange, distant tone. "He left a trail of broken promises and debts no one would touch. And you turned him away, didn't you? You turned him away when he needed help." Her blood ran cold. The memory tried to surface, but she clamped it down hard, burying it deep where it couldn't escape. "I didn't." The woman cut her off, her voice sharp now, cutting through the air between them. "You didn't have a choice. None of us do, really. She looked up, her chest tight with something she didn't understand. The woman's face had changed, softened somehow, as if she was seeing something different now, something that had been hidden. "You should be careful," the woman said, her voice a low murmur, full of warning. "A man like that will come back, and when he does, he'll come for what he's owed." She shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know what you mean." The woman didn't say anything more. She just turned, her shawl trailing behind her like a shadow. The market had returned to its usual noise, the chatter rising back into the air like it had never stopped. But it wasn't the same. The whispers followed her, behind her, between the stalls, and she could feel them like a weight on her shoulders. The baby stirred in her arms, and she looked down at him, feeling the coldness settle deeper inside her. She didn't know how much longer she could ignore the truth, but the more she tried, the harder it became to pretend she didn't already know. The baby's cries pierced the stillness, sharp and demanding. She jolted awake, the weight of sleep pulling at her limbs, but the sound of the baby crying pulled her fully into the cold light of the waking world. She checked the time. The sky outside the window was dark, the air thick with the chill of early morning. The baby's cries grew louder, more frantic, and she felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the child. She reached for him quickly, cradling his small, squirming body in her arms. His cries softened slightly as she rocked him, but his eyes were wide, unblinking, staring past her, over her shoulder. The house was silent, too silent. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the walls, but nothing else. She had learned to live with the quiet, had even come to find a strange comfort in it. But tonight, it felt wrong. She tried to soothe him, but something gnawed at her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, as though someone was watching her. She hesitated, feeling the air grow thick. Something was out there, beyond the safety of the walls. She didn't know why, but the feeling gnawed at her gut. The baby let out a small, low whimper, and her grip tightened instinctively. She walked over to the window, careful not to disturb him, and parted the curtains slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the yard. At first, she saw nothing. The trees, dark against the sky, their branches swaying in the wind. The dirt path leading toward the far end of the property was empty, but then something moved. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, just at the boundary of shadow and moonlight. It was still, too still. The shape was tall, broad-shouldered, but impossible to make out in the dark. She could feel the weight of the presence, the way it stretched out into the air, suffocating the silence around it. The baby cried again, a sudden sharp cry that rattled her chest, and for a moment the figure seemed to shift, like it was responding to the sound. Her heart beat faster, and she felt the weight of the moment press in around her. She swallowed hard and leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look, but the figure remained motionless, unmoving even as the baby's cries continued. "Who's there?" she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words left her mouth and disappeared into the stillness, swallowed up by the cold night air. There was no reply, no movement. She shifted the baby in her arms, pressing him closer to her chest, trying to calm him, but her heart was pounding too loud. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure, her breath catching in her throat as the minutes dragged on. "Who are you?" she said again, a little louder this time, but still, nothing. The figure didn't even flinch. It was like it wasn't even hearing her. Her mind raced, thoughts spinning too fast, each one more disorienting than the last. A shadow, a figure, standing still at the edge of the trees. Was it a person? Was it something else? She couldn't know, but something told her that if she didn't go outside, she might never find out. The baby's cries began to soften, but the tension in her chest remained. She gripped the baby tighter, turned, and walked quietly toward the door, the creaking floorboards beneath her feet only adding to the oppressive silence. She reached the door, paused, and then opened it slowly, careful not to wake the house. The night air rushed in, cold, sharp, and unfamiliar. She stepped out onto the porch, the old boards groaning underfoot. She didn't look back. The figure remained where it had been, still unmoving. The porch light flickered faintly, casting weak shadows across the yard. She squinted into the dark, but she couldn't make out any details. Just a figure, standing still, waiting, watching. "Who are you?" she called once more, her voice cutting through the stillness. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move. Her pulse quickened, and she stepped off the porch, the weight of the baby pressing in her arms. She moved slowly, her feet dragging through the dry grass, the world around her strangely quiet, like it was holding its breath too. The figure didn't stir as she approached, just standing there at the edge of the tree line, as if it had been waiting for her all this time. When she was just a few steps away, she called out again. "I said." The figure shifted then, just slightly, but it was enough to make her stop in her tracks. Her heart skipped, and the baby let out a soft cry, like he sensed the change too. The figure didn't move again, but it faded into the darkness like smoke, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come. She stood there, staring into the empty space where it had been, unsure of whether it had ever been there at all. The yard was empty again. Still, except for the whisper of wind through the trees. The baby's cries softened in her arms, and she looked down at him, her breath shaky. "It's gone," she murmured, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to reassure. But when she turned back to the house, her eyes flicked over to the spot where the figure had been, the place where the dark had swallowed it whole. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night. The chest sat at the foot of her bed, weathered and scratched from years of use. It was old, too old, its wood heavy and darkened by time, but it had never been locked until now. She didn't know why she'd never thought to look inside before. Maybe it was a matter of not wanting to know what was buried there. Her father had kept the key to it hidden, out of reach. But now, with his absence echoing through the house like a hollow wind, she didn't hesitate to find it. The key, as always, was tucked beneath the floorboard under the old rug. She retrieved it with shaking hands, the cool metal colder than it should have been. The sound of the chest creaking open filled the room, and a cloud of dust swirled around her like ghosts rising from forgotten corners. Inside, it was a mess of old papers, receipts, and letters, yellowed with age. The smell of ink and wood, and something old, like mildew or a forgotten memory, hit her, filling the air with the scent of things better left undisturbed. She began to sort through the pile, flipping over the old, brittle pages, her fingers catching on the edges, the ink fading where it had once been strong. Then one page caught her eye, a ledger, thin, lined, the kind her father had used to keep track of his business, the kind that always made her stomach twist when she'd seen it as a child. It had been his way of keeping order, but it had also kept him bound to things she couldn't understand. She pulled it out carefully, the spine cracking as she turned the first page. It was full of names, families that had lived here long before she was born, people her father had worked with, traded with, sold to. She ran her finger along the faded ink, her mind drifting over each name, each line a mark of a deal, an arrangement made in quiet shadows. She turned the page, and then another. But when she reached the next, something felt wrong. The page was torn, a jagged rip running down the center, cutting through the ink. It was as if someone had taken something out, a hole, a gap. She could see it clearly, like a name had been ripped from the ledger itself, and the page was never the same after that. She felt her stomach twist tighter, the room suddenly too small, the air too heavy. Her hand shook as she held the page, staring at the hole where something, someone, had been erased. Her fingers traced the torn edges, the jagged tear like a scar she couldn't heal. Slowly, carefully, she turned the page, hoping the answer would be there. The next page was intact, but her eyes were drawn immediately to the bold name at the top, a name that made her heart stutter in her chest. The Traitor. His name was listed there, beneath families now gone, names that had faded away with time. There was a list of transactions, one after the other, sales, trades, debt settled. But what made her pause was the word next to his name, written in thick black ink. Paid. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Paid. The word sat heavy on the page, like a mark she couldn't ignore. It felt like a trap, a door that had been opened, and there was nothing behind it but emptiness. She flipped back to the previous page, the one that had been torn. What had been so important that it needed to be erased? She felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. There had been something here, something hidden in her father's dealings. She could feel it in her gut, a pull toward the unknown that made her both terrified and determined. Who paid him? She whispered aloud to the empty room. Her words hung in the air, unanswered. The traitor, the one who had left the baby on her doorstep, the one her father had dealings with. What kind of debts were paid with children? What kind of bargain was sealed with that word? She turned back to the ledger, reading the names again, trying to make sense of it, but the letters swam before her eyes. The page blurred as the realization sank in. This was all connected. The traitor, the debts, the missing page, and the baby in her arms. Her father had made a deal. She didn't know when or why, but it was clear now. He had owed the traitor something that wasn't settled in money or goods. And now she was left to clean up the pieces, to deal with the price of whatever had been promised. She slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing through the room. But it didn't feel final. The hole in the page still haunted her. The name she couldn't see still gnawing at her. What had been taken from the ledger would be taken from her too, she realized. Whatever her father had promised, whatever debt had been paid, it was hers to face now. The house felt colder, the silence sharper. She glanced at the drawer where the note lay. The words still burned into her mind. "You promised." The baby stirred in her arms, pulling her attention back. He was quiet now, his eyes closed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than she did, that this was only the beginning. She slid the ledger back into the chest and locked it again, but the key didn't feel as secure in her hand as it once had. The answers were out there, somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. But every answer led to more questions, and every step forward took her further into something she wasn't ready to face. The ledger wasn't done with her. Neither was the traitor, and neither, she realized with a sinking feeling, was her father's legacy. The night was colder than she expected. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the dry earth as she made her way through the brush. Her boots crunched over the gravel path, each step echoing louder than it should. The quiet of the world around her felt suffocating, like something was waiting just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. She reached the edge of the clearing and saw him, a shadow sitting by the fire, his back to her, the faint scent of smoke rising in the cold night air. The mule was tethered nearby, grazing lazily, its ears flicking in the darkness. The traitor didn't move when she stepped into the open. He must have known she was coming. She cleared her throat. "I know it was you." The traitor didn't turn. He kept his focus on the flames, the light dancing across his face in uneven flickers. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice low and steady, like he had all the time in the world. "Where's the baby?" she demanded, taking another step closer, her heart thudding in her chest. He finally turned then, his face illuminated for a brief moment by the firelight. His features were sharp, hard, like someone who had spent too many years in the sun. But it wasn't the weathered lines that made her stomach churn. It was his eyes. They were cold, calculating, like he'd seen this moment coming 100 times before. "I didn't leave any baby on your doorstep," he said, his tone smooth, almost amused. "That's not my doing." She felt the knot in her chest tighten. The anger bubbled up, rising in her throat. I saw you leave it. You did this. You're the one who—" The traitor raised a hand, his fingers barely moving, and the words stopped in her mouth. There was no force in the gesture, no threat, but it made her pause, made her freeze in place. "You're wrong," he said. His voice softened, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "I didn't leave the baby. I left it with you." "Yes, but I didn't leave it. You're the one who accepted it." "Accepted it?" She repeated the words like they didn't make sense. "I didn't—" "You did." He leaned forward, staring at her as if he were reading her every thought. "You see, you don't get to choose when a debt comes due. You don't get to walk away from it. Your father, he knew that. He understood it better than anyone." Her throat went dry. She shook her head. "You have no right to speak about my father." But his eyes didn't waver. He kept watching her, waiting for her to get it, like it was all already decided. "You think he didn't know what he was doing? You think he didn't understand the price?" Her blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" "The price of the deal," he said, his voice dropping lower, colder, like the very air around them had shifted. "The price of the debt he owed." She felt a chill that wasn't from the cold night air. "What did he promise you?" she asked, the question tasting bitter on her tongue, though she already had a feeling she didn't want the answer. The traitor's smile widened, but it wasn't kind. It was knowing, like he'd already seen this moment unfold 1,000 times. "Your father promised me the only thing worth anything," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice soft but clear. "He promised you." Her heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat. "What? Number he wouldn't." Her hand trembled as she reached for the baby still held tightly in her arms. She felt his small body, warm and soft, and the truth began to unfurl like a twisted thing inside her chest. "You're the one who can settle the debt now," he continued, his words slow, deliberate, like they were sinking into her skin. "You're the one who can finish what your father started. You're the one who can take what was promised." Her knees felt weak. She stepped back, the firelight flickering in front of her like it was blurring everything. The world felt distant, warped. Her mind raced, but the pieces wouldn't fit together. Her father, he had made a deal. But this wasn't something she had ever expected. She wanted to say no, to tell him that it wasn't true, that he had no hold over her. But she knew he did. She had always known. The debts, the silence, the way her father had kept things from her, kept her away from the truth. "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound steady. "I'm not involved in this. I don't owe you anything." The trader tilted his head, his smile never fading. "You don't owe me anything." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But you do owe what your father left unfinished." Her pulse thudded in her ears, her hands tightening around the baby. She looked at the trader, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the truth in his eyes. The truth that her father had made a deal with a man like him, a man who didn't deal in money or favors, but in blood. "You can walk away," he added, his voice smooth, dangerous, "but the debt doesn't go away, not until it's paid." She didn't know what to say. The words, the weight of them, pressed down on her chest. She glanced down at the baby, his eyes wide and unblinking, and something cold, something darker than she'd ever felt twisted in her gut. "I didn't make this promise," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This wasn't my choice." The trader chuckled softly, his eyes glinting. "It never is. But the price will always come due." He stood, the shadows stretching long behind him, and without another word, he turned, walking away into the darkness, the firelight fading with each step he took. She stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of the night press in around her. The world felt quieter now, the firelight leaving her with only the echo of his words. The debt wasn't hers to settle, but somehow she knew she couldn't walk away from it. Not anymore. The baby shifted in her arms, and she held him closer, feeling the weight of the promise her father had made and the price she was now forced to face. The old saloon smelled of wood smoke and spilled whiskey. It was late, far past closing time, and the place was mostly empty, save for the occasional stray drinker nursing the remnants of their last glass. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the floor, stretching out like fingers reaching toward the corners of the room. She hadn't meant to be there. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, but she'd been walking back from the market when she saw them. 3 figures stepping into the back room, the door closing behind them with a soft creak. She knew one of them by sight, the trader. The other 2, though, were new to her. The sheriff she recognized, his silhouette broad and imposing, but it was the older woman who caught her attention, the one she'd seen once before, speaking in hushed tones about debts and promises, the one who had warned her about the trader. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see their body language, the way the sheriff shifted, the slight tension in the air between them, like something was being passed, something heavy. It was then that she realized they were making a deal, the deal she had yet to understand. She wasn't sure what made her step closer to the door, the cool wood against her palm as she leaned in, straining to hear. She couldn't help herself. She had to know. The first words she caught were the sheriff's. "Promises kept," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. "No one likes to be left holding the bag." The trader's voice followed, smooth and calculating. "It's not about bags, Sheriff. It's about rights. The child's right." The words hit her like a stone, heavy and cold. The child. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, her pulse quickening. She had heard enough. The baby, the one who had been left on her doorstep, wasn't just some random stranger's child. It was at the heart of whatever bargain they were discussing, whatever deal had been made long before her time. "There's no going back," the woman's voice broke in, steady and sharp. "The bargain is struck, and the debt will be settled, but it's her choice now." She couldn't breathe. Her heart felt like it was caught in a vice, squeezing tighter with each word they spoke. The woman. She was talking about her, about the choice she had, or didn't have. She was the one who would be forced to make it right. "No one asked her for a choice," the sheriff muttered, his voice dark. She doesn't get one. No one does." "You don't," the trader said with a laugh low and dangerous. "She does." The old woman's voice softened, almost sympathetic. "It's always the ones who don't know that get caught in the middle. The child is the key. It's a right that must be fulfilled, no matter the cost. But you've got to get her to understand. She's the one who has to decide." She didn't know how long she stood there, holding her breath, listening to the words that made her stomach twist and her legs feel like lead. The door creaked again, and her heart nearly stopped. "Is she listening?" the sheriff asked, his voice sharp. He was close now, close enough for her to feel the heat from his breath. She jerked back, stepping away from the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had to move, had to leave, but her feet felt stuck to the floor. She stayed in the shadows, holding her breath. She could hear them, feel their presence, even as they walked away from the door. She's listening. The woman's voice was steady, but she could hear the tension in it. She has to. There's no other way. The door swung open just a crack, and she heard footsteps moving in her direction. She froze, then darted behind a barrel, clutching the edge of it like it would shield her from what she now knew. The trader and the sheriff passed by, close enough for her to smell the faint scent of leather and gunpowder. She didn't dare move, didn't even breathe. When they were gone, the door swung back, leaving her standing alone in the quiet, the weight of their words pressing down on her chest. She turned toward the back room, the soft murmur of the remaining conversation still hanging in the air. She knew she had to hear the rest. Carefully, she crept forward again, just enough to catch the final words before the conversation ended. "You'll make sure she understands?" the woman asked. There was a hint of concern in her voice, but it was tinged with something darker, something final. "Of course," the trader replied. "I always collect, and this time I'll make sure the price is paid in full." She staggered back, the blood draining from her face. The price. What price? And why was it always her that had to pay it? The deal, the bargain, the debt. It was all clearer now, clearer than it had ever been. She wasn't just caught up in something her father had done. She was at the center of it. The baby wasn't just a random child. The baby was the heart of an unfinished bargain. A debt owed, a deal struck, and she was the one left to make it right. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no running from this, no escape. She couldn't turn her back on it now, not when she had just heard the truth in its rawest form. Her father's choices had brought her to this moment, but the next move was hers to make. The baby wasn't hers by birth, but the trader's words rang in her mind. The child's right. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, but she didn't know what she was supposed to do. And no matter how much she tried to turn away, she knew the answer would find her. It always did. The wind howled through the trees as she made her way behind her father's store, her steps slow, deliberate. She had been here countless times as a child, running between the wooden crates and barrels, playing hide and seek in the dusty shadows of the back lot. But now, everything felt different, darker, heavier. The store was empty now, the shelves bare, the air stale with the smell of forgotten things. The world around her had quieted, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She stopped in front of the well. It had always been a part of the property, but she'd never thought much of it. Just an old, dried-up thing, covered with a rusted metal grate that had long since stopped being useful. But the trader had mentioned it, had told her that she would find something here, something that would make sense of everything. And though she didn't know why, she believed him. The ground around the well was uneven, cracked by years of neglect, the stones rough beneath her boots. She kneeled down, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the grate. It had been years since she'd last looked down into the well, but she remembered it well enough. The emptiness, the hollow space below. She ran her hands over the edges of the grate, trying to pry it open, but the metal resisted. It was old, stubborn, just like everything else here. Her chest tightened, a knot of unease settling in her stomach. She didn't know why, but it felt like something was waiting for her. Something had been waiting here, buried in the shadows. With a grunt, she shifted her weight, pulling harder on the grate. It screeched as it gave way, and she staggered back as it came loose, the rusted metal scraping loudly against the stone. The well's dark mouth opened, and she stared down into the pitch-black abyss. For a moment, she hesitated. It was deep, too deep, and she felt the weight of it settle in her bones. But she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she knew there was something here, something that would give her the answers she had been chasing. She reached down and found a loose stone near the edge of the well. It gave way easily, falling with a dull thud into the darkness below. A faint echo followed, and then silence. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a breath, gathering herself. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver light across the yard. She squatted beside the well, her hand shaking as she fumbled through her pockets. The note, still crumpled from earlier, pressed against her fingers. She unfolded it again. The words, "You promised," staring up at her. Taking a deep breath, she let the paper fall from her hand and glanced down into the well. She could feel the presence of something in the darkness. There was no going back. Without thinking, she reached for a nearby wooden beam that had fallen from one of the broken structures on the property. She wedged it into the grate and used it to steady herself as she leaned down into the well. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, pulling her deeper into the silence. She heard the faintest sound, something metal, something old scraping against the stones. A box, a rusted tin box. Her breath caught in her throat. The trader's words rushed back to her. The debt must be paid. The box. Her hands trembled as she reached down into the well, feeling around, trying to grasp it. After a few moments of searching, her fingers closed around the cold metal. She pulled it up slowly, careful not to drop it back into the depths. When she finally held it in her hands, the weight of it felt more substantial than it should have. The box was small, rectangular, covered in rust and dirt, but there was something familiar about it. She held it in the moonlight, the outline of the box sharp against the shadows. There was no name, no mark, just a simple faded metal lid. It was heavy, like it contained something precious, or something dangerous. Her breath hitched as she pried open the lid, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Inside there were a few yellowed letters, receipts crumpled from age, and a small wooden toy, the carving worn smooth by time. The toy, a small wooden horse, was carved with careful precision, its legs splayed as though frozen in time. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, and as she turned it over, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The faint remnants of a fabric pattern burned into the wood. It was the same as the baby's blanket. She stared at the toy, the weight of realization crashing over her. The baby, this child, was tied to this box, these receipts, this toy. Everything her father had hidden away was finally coming to light. The letters were faded, too blurry to read at first, but she forced herself to unfold them one by one. As she read, the words blurred together. Deals made, names traded, and at the bottom of each letter, the same signature, a promise, a debt, and, most telling of all, the name of the trader, the one who had always come to collect. Her hands shook as she set the toy aside. The weight of the letters pressed down on her chest like stones. This wasn't a coincidence. The baby wasn't a random act of fate. It wasn't some forgotten child left on her doorstep. It was part of something her father had agreed to long before she was born. A deal, a debt, and the baby. The child's right was the price. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the well's darkness pulling her in deeper. The trader's warning echoed in her mind. The debt doesn't go away. Her father had promised to pay for it, and now it was her turn to settle it. She closed the tin box with trembling hands, the finality of it sinking into her bones. Whatever this was, whatever had been set into motion long ago, it had come for her, and there was no running from it. The wind had picked up by the time she heard the knock. It was late, too late for anyone to be calling. She had been pacing in the dim light of the kitchen, her thoughts tangled around the letters, the tin box, the faded signature that had confirmed what she had already known deep down. The weight of it all was crushing her, pulling her toward a place she didn't want to go. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved toward the door. She didn't need to look through the peephole. She already knew who it was. The traitor. Her hand was shaking as she reached for the handle, but she forced herself to steady it. She swung the door open, and there he stood, just outside the threshold, his figure outlined by the dim light from the porch. His coat was thick, his hat low, casting shadows over his face. His eyes were the only thing that shone, cold and unwavering, like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching him, waiting for him to speak, as though she could push the truth away by refusing to acknowledge it. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice smooth, casual, like they were simply having a conversation, "about your father's debt, about what's left to pay." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. The night seemed to swallow the sound of his voice, and for a moment, all she could hear was the faint rustling of the wind, the crackle of the dry leaves skittering across the yard. "You think you can just walk away from it?" he asked, his eyes narrowing, studying her every move. "You think that if you turn your back, it will just vanish? That's not how it works, miss." She stood there, silent, heart racing, her mind flooded with the weight of his words. She could feel the baby in her arms shifting slightly, still unaware of the gravity of what was happening. He wasn't just a child anymore. He was the price. Her price. "The deal was sealed with blood," the trader continued, his voice low, almost reverent. "Your father's blood, and now it's yours too if you refuse. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of paying what's owed." Her breath hitched. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to know the truth. But she couldn't turn away from him. Not now. Not when everything had already been set in motion. She took a step back, holding the baby closer to her chest, as if she could protect him from the words, from the truth she had already seen, written in the ledger, in the letters, in the very air between them. "You don't understand," she said, her voice strained, her fingers curling tighter around the child. "This isn't right. I don't owe you anything." The trader chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "No, you don't think you do. Your father made sure of that. He made the bargain, the deal, and now the debt is yours. It's always been yours." He took a step closer, and she instinctively stepped back, the cold draft from the open door making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't ask for any of it. I didn't make the deal." The trader's eyes darkened. "It doesn't matter whether you asked for it or not. What matters is that it's been promised. The price is due." His gaze flicked to the baby in her arms, and she could feel his words like a weight pressing down on her chest. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to slam the door, to turn away, to forget about everything he had said, but she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. "You can't run from this," he said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "Not now. Not after everything that's been done." She stared at him, the truth settling in like a stone in her gut. She could feel the heaviness of the bargain, the blood-stained promise her father had made. She was trapped, caught between the past and the present, with no way out. "I'll leave," the trader said, taking a step back, his voice still calm, still cold. "But don't think this is over. It never is." She didn't move as he turned and walked away, his figure swallowed by the night. The door hung open, the air rushing past her, cold and biting. She didn't know how long she stood there, watching the darkness consume him, but it felt like hours, like days, like an eternity. When she finally closed the door, the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. The baby shifted in her arms, a soft, comforting sound in the silence of the house. She held him tighter, the finality of it all crashing down around her. She hadn't made the deal. She hadn't chosen this. But now, she was the one left to pay. The trader had gone, but the threat lingered in the stillness, hanging in the air like smoke. The blood price had been set, and there was no escaping it now. She had no choice but to face it. The room was cold, the fire in the hearth casting long shadows across the floor. She paced back and forth, the weight of the decision pressing down on her with each step. She had summoned them all, the trader, the sheriff, and the older woman. Each of them played a part in the twisted bargain her father had left behind, and each of them held a piece of the puzzle she was desperately trying to solve. The knock on the door was sharp, cutting through the silence. She didn't hesitate, opening it to reveal the sheriff standing there, his coat pulled tightly around him to ward off the cold. His eyes scanned the room quickly, then fixed on her. "You wanted to see me," he said, his voice low, tinged with a mixture of suspicion and weariness. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "The others will be here soon." He stepped past her, his boots scraping softly against the wooden floor as he looked around. His gaze lingered for a moment on the empty cradle by the fire, but he didn't comment. "I'm not sure what you're expecting here," the sheriff muttered, his voice still laced with caution. "But I'm not one for playing games." She didn't respond. Instead, she simply walked to the table and placed the tin box in front of him. The lid was slightly ajar, the contents visible, letters, receipts, and the small carved toy. She didn't wait for him to say anything. The door opened again, and the trader stepped in, his presence filling the room. His coat was thick, the brim of his hat low, shadowing his face. He didn't acknowledge her directly, just moved to the table where the box lay. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and calculating. "Looks like we've all been invited to the same table. What's this about?" She didn't answer at first. Her gaze flicked to the older woman who entered last, her steps slow but steady. The woman's eyes darted to the box, then back to her. "You've gathered us here for a reason," the woman said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of something deeper. "I assume you figured out the truth by now." She nodded, her hands resting at her sides, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on her. "I know what my father promised, and now it's my turn to settle the debt." The sheriff crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. "Debt? What kind of debt are we talking about here?" The trader's lips twitched, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "A debt of blood, Sheriff. Nothing new around here." The woman's eyes flicked between them. "It's always blood, isn't it? People can talk about debts, but it's the blood that really makes it final." She opened the box slowly, letting the contents spill out one by one. The letters, the receipts, and the small wooden toy, its edges worn smooth. She let them see it all. She let them see what her father had left behind. The trader leaned in, his fingers brushing over the toy, turning it over in his hands. "This," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent, "this is where it began." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? My father never told me about any of this." "Oh, but he didn't need to, did he?" The trader's voice dropped lower, almost like he was speaking to himself. "He made the deal, and you're the one who's going to finish it." He looked up, his eyes cold. "You don't get to walk away from what was promised." The older woman's voice broke through the silence. "The child," she said simply. "That's what it's always been about." Her heart raced, her stomach twisting. She knew it, but hearing it out loud made the weight of it unbearable. The baby, the price. "You've known all along," the woman continued, her tone almost sad. "The child's right. It was never just a child. It was the cost of your father's promises." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the truth hanging, heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. The trader's gaze softened just slightly. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice quieter now. "But a deal's a deal, and it's always the ones who don't know that have to pay for it." She clenched her fists at her sides, her heart pounding. "I didn't make this deal. I didn't ask for this." "You didn't have to," the woman said, her voice tinged with something that might have been pity. "It was done long before you came into this world." She stood there, silent, feeling the weight of the box in front of her. The letters, the toy, the receipt. Each piece a part of a puzzle she couldn't quite finish. But the truth was clear now. The baby wasn't a mistake. It wasn't random. It was a price. Her price. She glanced up at the trader. "What happens now?" His eyes held hers, cold and unyielding. "Now, you settle the debt. It's what's been promised, and there's no going back." The room fell silent. The fire crackled in the background, but all she could hear was the weight of the choice she now had to make. The room was heavy with the weight of what had already been said. The trader stood by the table, the tin box still open before him. The sheriff leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face unreadable. The older woman sat motionless, watching them all. She could feel the silence press in around her, thick and suffocating. She straightened, taking a deep breath. The time had come. There was no turning back now. "I'll offer one last trade," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "The truth, the box, in exchange for the child's safety." The sheriff looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Safety?" His voice was sharp, incredulous. "What do you mean by safety?" "The child's life," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "You want the box, the letters, the records. I'll give them to you in exchange for his safety. No more debts. No more promises. Just let him go." The older woman let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You think you understand what safety is?" she asked, her voice low, but edged with something dangerous. You think you can just walk away from this? From the price that's been set?" The trader hesitated, his fingers resting on the edge of the tin box, but he didn't move. His gaze flicked between her and the sheriff, weighing the offer. He didn't speak right away, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped, like everything was suspended in the air, just waiting for someone to make the wrong move. "Give me the box," the sheriff said finally, his tone flat, emotionless. "And we'll be done with this. No more talking, no more threats." She shook her head. "I'm not giving you the box. Not for that. I'm offering the truth, the full truth. Do you want it? Then let the child go. Let him leave here and no one gets hurt." The sheriff's hand slid toward the gun holstered at his side, his jaw tight, but before he could move, the trader spoke up. "Hold on," he said, his voice cold and calm. "This isn't just about a trade anymore. This is about what you're offering." His eyes locked onto hers. "The truth. The box. You're asking us to take it all, but if we do, there's no going back. You'll be free, but you'll never escape the weight of it. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the child, he's not part of this anymore. I'm the one who has to pay." The older woman's gaze hardened, and she leaned forward. "You don't understand," she warned. "You think safety is a matter of distance, of walking away. But safety is a lie. No one walks away from this deal untouched." Before she could respond, the sheriff's hand was already on the grip of his gun, his fingers twitching, but the trader raised a hand, stilling him. The tension in the room thickened, electric, charged with the weight of unspoken threats. "Put the gun down," the trader said softly, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "We're not killing anyone today. Not yet." But the sheriff didn't lower his gun. The older woman didn't move either, her eyes locked on the child, now silent in her arms. There was a long pause, long enough for the truth to sink in, long enough for her to understand that no one here would be walking away unscathed. The choice had been made, the sides were drawn, and she knew deep in her gut that nothing would be the same after this. She had offered everything, her father's past, the box, the truth, and they had made their choice. A gun was drawn, but this time the shot wasn't fired. Not yet, not by them. The child's fate had already been sealed, long before they'd met, and now it was too late for anything to be undone. The silence in the house was deafening. She didn't know when the sheriff had left, whether he had fled or fallen, but it didn't matter now. The result was the same. He was gone, and whatever had been left unfinished between them had been sealed in blood. The trader had slipped into the hills, vanishing without a trace, as he always did. His words echoed in her mind. The debt will be paid. But that was all he was. A shadow. Another figure from the past. Another ghost. She sat down slowly, the baby nestled in her arms, the weight of the child grounding her, tethering her to the present. She couldn't escape the past, no matter how hard she tried. But the baby, he was a part of the future. Her future. The room was dim now, the light from the oil lamp growing faint as the hours passed. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been said. She looked down at the note resting on the table beside her. The same words, the same truth. "You promised." Her fingers hovered over it, the paper soft beneath her. Touch, but it wasn't the words that mattered now. It was the child, the promise she'd made to him. She kissed the baby's forehead, feeling his warmth, his tiny breaths. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, then closed again. He was unaware of the world around him, of the mess she had inherited. He was innocent, untouched by the debts and bargains that had been made before his birth. "I promise," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This time, she meant it, not just for him, but for herself. She would protect him. She would give him a future, a chance that neither she nor her father had been given. The room grew darker still as the lamp burned low. The soft hiss of the flame was the only sound in the house, its shadows stretching long across the walls. She didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, holding the baby close, waiting for the night to pass. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it was quiet, still. She let herself breathe, let the silence wash over her. The promises were done. The debts were settled. She was free. The lamp flickered once more, then went out, leaving the house in complete darkness. But it didn't matter. She had made her promise, and that was enough. "I promise," she said again, this time for herself, for the future. And she knew, deep down, she would keep it, no matter what came next.